The problem the British Commander-in-Chief Middle East, General Sir Claude Auchinleck, faced in the North African desert in May 1942 was how to defend such a large desolate area with limited troops and supplies against the mobile German Afrika Korps and their Italian allies. General Oberst Erwin Rommel liked to attack when he could and dictate the terms of the battle onto the enemy. Auchinleck had to make an effort to defend the desert, because if he didn't, then the wily German desert fox would simply drive past their positions and isolate them from land supply, making air or sea resupply the only possible options. The defensive concept the British came up with was called the box, which was a fortified strong point in flat surrounding terrain. Boxes were instant fortresses which could be defended against attack from any direction. It appears that British generals took a map, drew a line where they wanted to defend, and evenly spaced boxes out in the desert like a string of pearls, in the middle of nowhere. Each box was about 6 miles, or 9.7 kilometers, away from each other. This would provide some measure of defense against panzers in a featureless terrain. A large town or city on the coast would be defended in a more conventional way. Fighting in the desert in World War II had its own unique problems and advantages. One of the best advantages was that the entire land was tank country. A tank commander could organize his armored attack from a map without regard to buildings, cities, or much of anything standing in the way. If your armor gained the advantage, then you could chase down your enemies and literally roll over them. So, as a soldier, it was imperative to never find yourself in a position where your side had no tanks and no anti-tank guns and your enemy still had armored vehicles in the desert. In Europe, a soldier rarely found himself in this position. There was almost always somewhere to hide, like a house, a ditch, or a grassy field. None of these exist out in the desert. The British box attempted to mitigate the armored advantage of Rommel's panzers. Each box had many modern defensive weapons at its disposal, including mines, barbed wire entanglements, bunkers, listening posts, and tanks. The dug-in positions were designed to break up the Afrika Korps panzer columns with a series of trenches, 75mm guns, rifle pits, tank obstacles, and machine gun nests. Each box was roughly a square mile, with a typical example having a brigade of roughly 3,600 men, depending on the amount of men the British had to spare. Each box was supplied with an abundance of food, water, ammunition, and supplies of every description, and had the potential to survive in combat, isolated and completely on its own, for several days. There were a few theories behind the defensive boxes. Logistics out in the desert was hard even without Germans shooting at you, so the British generals wanted to ensure that the troops in the boxes were stocked up and could hold out long enough without resupply. If a box came under attack, theoretically, the mobile armored reserve would come to its rescue, save the day, and hopefully destroy the attacking Axis troops in the process. So, why couldn't the Germans just simply drive through the wide open spaces between the boxes? There were two main reasons. British engineers laid vast amounts of mines. For example, on the Gazala line, more than 1 million mines were laid on a scale never yet seen in the war in North Africa. One source stated that there were 1.5 million mines. To prevent the Germans from easily forging a path through the thick minefields, regular patrols were used to cover the gaps between the boxes. The British hoped that Rommel and the Afrika Korps would try to push through a minefield, attempting to circumvent the boxes while taking losses. It was hoped that an attritional slugfest would ensue while they were bogged down, much like earlier battles in the First World War. Then, as stated before, British armor would sweep in and come to their rescue. Rommel knew he had little chance of winning such a battle, because both sides knew that the British could more easily replace losses of men, equipment, and supplies. Instead, Rommel used one of his advantages, the fast-paced armored battle of maneuver. So, how did Rommel overcome the British boxes? First, we need to realize that he didn't have to attack every box. Theoretically, he could concentrate all available firepower on a single isolated box at a vital juncture, overwhelm it, and then push further east. The boxes weren't mutually supporting, so Rommel could focus on one at a time. By using overwhelming force and Luftwaffe support, one by one, Rommel knocked out the British boxes that were preventing his army's eastward movement. Minefields didn't always have to be traversed. If the Germans and Italians advanced very far into the British rear area, then the other boxes would have to evacuate because the line would be unhinged. Why would this matter? Initially, it wouldn't, because of their abundance of supplies. But if the armored reserve wasn't coming to save the day, then there only remained for the Allied soldier of being a casualty or being captured, because there's nowhere to hide in the desert. Pushing east, Rommel's army increasingly began to suffer from severe supply shortages, which slowed the Afrika Korps down. To give an example of an attack on an Allied box, on the morning of May 31, 1942, in the Battle of Gazala, after a combined aerial and artillery bombardment, the Desert Fox ordered an all-out attack on the Sidi Mufti box. Rommel wrote in his diary, German-Italian units fought their way forward yard by yard against the toughest British resistance imaginable. Nevertheless, by the time evening came, we had penetrated a substantial distance into the British positions. After heavy Stuka attacks, the infantry again surged forward against the British field positions. Piece by piece, the elaborate British defenses were won until, by early afternoon, the whole position was ours. The last British resistance was quenched. We took in all 3,000 prisoners and destroyed or captured 101 tanks and armored cars, as well as 124 guns of all kinds. Rommel's units overran the box, which was the scene of desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The British 150th Infantry Brigade was destroyed in the process. Generally, when the Germans and Italians captured a box, there were still substantial supplies such as food, ammunition, and booty, which helped fuel the Axis drive even more. It probably gave them a further incentive to capture other boxes. This box was part of the 60-mile-long Gazala line, which was a marvel of British engineering and effort in 1942. The defenses ran south from Gazala on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea for 40 miles, and then angled sharply another 20 miles to the northeast to protect the British left flank. It was the first time that an attempt had been made to build a line of this kind so far into the desert. The British were trying to reintroduce Stellungskrieg, or static warfare, back to the desert, in order to defeat Rommel. The El Adem box with the Batruna strongpoint was mentioned by Rommel in his diary. A violent exchange of fire soon blazed up between our tanks and the Indians defending the box. That evening, Batruna was stormed with the capture of 800 prisoners and numerous guns and other war material. So, what went wrong with the British boxes? On one hand, it was good to try to set up some sort of defense in the desert where there are no natural defenses. When the battle came, communications broke down. The armored reserve didn't arrive. British commanders seemed paralyzed and issued orders with bad information. Worst of all, the boxes couldn't mutually support each other, which is a fatal flaw in military theory. A better idea would be to have smaller boxes that mutually supported each other on each flank. James Holland wrote, as Rommel said to a captured British officer, "What difference does it make if you have 2 tanks to my 1, when you spread them out and let me smash them in detail?" That one sentence really did encapsulate the nub of the matter and the failure of the Aux approach. Frankly, he and his senior commander should have known better by now.